G'day everyone. I'm really excited about this latest release of Rush Hour 1.4. It's got some really cool new features which are going to make it much easier to make some really cool videos, and I can't wait to see what you all do with it. Today I wanted to walk you through some of the features behind it that I demonstrated in that trailer that you just watched. I think first things first, and we'll lay a path down, and then we'll set up a convoy spawner and get some traffic going, and I'll walk you through all of that. This will highlight the first change that's included in Rush Hour 1.4. It's no longer called Vehicle Animation Path, it's called Rush Hour Path. So if we come up and go to All Classes and we type in Rush, we can see Rush Hour Path. So if we drag that down as normal, nothing really has changed too much. So now what we'll do is we'll just drag this all the way out. Depending on what vehicles you're using, sometimes they might be a little bit, they might take corners a little bit wide. So what we'll do is we might just have to play with this path just a little bit. So I'm happy to give that a go for now. We'll hit align to ground, and usually we'd come down here and we'd change the driver profile and change the vehicle type. We'll just quickly test that it's driving. So if we just hit play, so the vehicle's driving as normal. Now that we're happy that the vehicle drives, what we'll do is we'll add the Convoy Spawner in. So to add the Convoy Spawner, we want to first of all come across to settings in our content browser and make sure that engine content is enabled and show plugin content is enabled. And then in the left over here, you want to scroll down. This might appear a little bit different. For you, it might be under engine plugins, but for me, it's just in plugins. But if you don't see Rush Hour Vehicle Animator content, it's probably under engine plugins down here. Either way, we want to open up the Vehicle Animator content, and we want to go to Blueprints, Utilities, and we can see that we've got this BPRH Convoy Spawner. So drag that in, and we can see this fancy little icon. Ignore my programmer art. And we'll just have a quick look at the settings for this. First thing, we need to link it to our existing path. So under Convoy Settings Path, we can hit this eyedropper and click on our path. And we can see that it's got the path linked there now. One thing that it will do is it takes over some of the settings of this path. If we select it, what we can immediately notice is that auto start is forcibly disabled. That's because the Convoy Spawner is going to take care of all the settings from here on out. So anytime you want to change the vehicles, the driver profile strength, all of that is going to be changed on the Convoy Spawner from here. The next thing is we've got a list of vehicles right here. This can have as many or as few vehicles as you want. By default, I've added the 3 vehicles that are included with Rush Hour just to get you going. But if you don't want those, you can hit this drop down and hit delete, or you can clear it out by pressing X, or you can click on it and change what type of vehicle you want it to be. So we can make it a marketplace vehicle that I've downloaded. The next thing is that this Convoy Spawner is designed to be fairly repeatable. An advantage of that is that you don't need to record the vehicles that are on this. If it's just going to be background traffic, you don't really want to have to spend the time recording it. Because Rush Hour is fairly repeatable and it's going to be a steady frame rate when you render it with Movie Render Queue, for the most part, for a lot of shots, you'll be able to get away with just letting the traffic run. And because you can control it and make it turn away from corners, you can generally keep the traffic vehicles out of the immediate important aspects of your scene. This way you can control it around camera angles and so on. Unlike a full traffic system like the city sample would have, where the vehicles might just cross in front of the camera, here you can have the path stop early or turn away, and you can fully control where the cars are going to go. And then on top of that, I've tried to make this spawn vehicles in the same order every time. There's a few ways that you can change the spawning order of vehicles. The first one is ticking random spawn order. In this case, it's just going to use the vehicles that you've selected in the vehicle list, and it's going to randomly pick from them. Even though I've said that this is quite repeatable, that's controlled by something down here called the Convoy Randomizer, which we'll come to in a minute. But for now, if you tick on random spawn order, it will randomly select these vehicles. It will still pick them in the same order between runs. It's just that it's not going to respect the order in which you've put it in. Whereas if you have this off, it will spawn the sedan, and then it will spawn the racer, and then it will spawn the box truck, and then it will start from the beginning. So random spawn order will just shuffle that up. And then spawn count, we can choose how many vehicles to spawn. We might not want it to endlessly spawn 1,000 vehicles, but then again, we might. So you can just choose how many vehicles you want it to spawn. It defaults at 10, but choose whatever value you want. The next thing is we've got these spawn intervals. So it will randomly choose a time between 3.5 seconds and 4.5 seconds by default. Sometimes you're going to have it where a vehicle moves off the starting mark a little bit too slowly and a vehicle will fail to spawn, in which case you might want to increase that spawn interval. Or maybe you want it more uniform, or maybe you want it a little bit more varied, at which point you can increase or decrease the minimum and maximum of that to get a little bit more control over it. The next setting we have is the driver profile. In this case, because I want to do something a little bit more like traffic, I'm going to go with a Sunday driver. And here also you can change the profile strength. So this is just like the profile strength on the normal path. If we want it to be more or less like a racer or a Sunday driver, it will randomly choose between those two values. Again, it will choose the same random value for each car as long as you don't change a setting. So the randomness is only valid for a given configuration. If you turn on or off random spawn or a few other things, it will change it up. But if you don't change any settings, it's going to be the same. And if you did change a setting and it's not quite what you want, you can go back to the old setting and it will try and spawn in the same order again. So the next thing is auto start is now here. In this case, we may or may not want the Convoy to just auto start. We might want to control it through blueprints. For now, that's for another topic, but for now, we're just going to leave it on auto start. That works very much the same as auto start on the path. Just once again, because this takes over the control of that existing path, it's all been moved here. Now, cornering force minimum and maximum, that's a new feature in 1.4. That also exists on the normal path, and also it exists on individual waypoints as well. I'm going to cover that specifically when we get to the handbrake section. But for now, just know that will affect how aggressively a vehicle will approach a corner. Previously, that's been entirely relying on the training that you have to do per vehicle. But now we have a little bit more artistic control over that. So we can say on an individual corner and on the whole path, and both at once, we can say approach corners harder, approach corners slower, and so on. The next settings here are just how it preloads vehicles and whether or not to force spawning. Async preload will just stop hitching if you're using this at runtime, but if you're using this with movie render queue, this shouldn't matter too much. And force spawning, before when I said that a vehicle may or may not move off the path in time, you can tick on force spawning, at which point it will just force the vehicle to spawn. But if you do that, you might have vehicles collide or maybe even spawn inside of each other and fly off to the moon. So just be careful with that, but it's there if you do need it. Now we're going to move down to the Convoy randomizer. This has two things. This has a random seed here and a button to generate a random seed. If you're at all familiar with Minecraft worlds or whatever and you have to choose a random seed, this is very much the same concept. So for a given starting seed, it will change the randomness going forward. The value itself is somewhat unimportant. You can't change it and choose a value and go, well, actually, I wanted like a different order and I want to have a bit more control over that order. The random seed is the base number that random numbers are chosen from going forward. So it's not something that you can directly control and say, well, actually, I want this vehicle to spawn before that vehicle so I can choose this random seed. It's more about just like putting all your dice back in a bag and shuffling that bag and knowing that you're going to start with that same bag every time. So yeah, if you choose 1024, the vehicles from here on out will always spawn in the same order for this same configuration. But sometimes you don't want to choose a random number or whatever, so you can just press randomize random seed, and it's just going to give you a random number every time. And if you do find a configuration you like, make sure to save the level. And if you're really, really worried about it, you can also copy that down into a notepad or something. But yeah, just save the level and that should be fine. But when you start the level and you go, that's not actually the vehicle that I want to see, or I'm not happy with the order that they're coming out, just come down and press randomize random seed and it should be fine. So now I've walked you through all that. What we'll do is we'll come up to here and we'll go simulate. And we can see that all these vehicles are just going to spawn in. So we can see here that we didn't have it on random spawn, but the blue car, the sedan, didn't spawn in again. So what we can suspect there is that we didn't actually move the box truck off fast enough. So if we come down to output log, so in the output log, we're getting a lot of spam from a lot of different other things going on. So we're just going to type in Convoy into this search box at the top. And we can see down here, we've got a few different warnings here. First of all, it talks about how it preloaded those vehicles. The next thing is we can see we've got 2 warnings, no car spawned and no car spawned. Ideally, you'd choose settings in the spawn timing that would make it so that doesn't happen, but sometimes it will happen. It's not a big deal, but just be aware that it might affect the randomness a little bit. Now, if we come back up here and search for Convoy Spawner and click on Convoy, if we now press random spawn order, we should notice that the vehicles spawn in a different order from now on. So we've got the sedan, the sedan again, we did also see one car not spawn, and it's choosing the sedan an awful lot here. Now we finally got a box truck. So I'm not actually that happy with that random spawn order, so we'll come down here and we'll choose random seed and press play again. There we go. So we're now getting a different order just by changing that random seed. So I think we got one more not spawn, and we had sedan, racer, racer. So let's hit play again and we should see the same order. So sedan, racer, failed to spawn, racer. So yeah, from a given seed, you can see that you're going to get the same vehicles every time. So one more feature I wanted to demonstrate with this, if we come all the way to the end of this path, this is where we got to the end of the path, and we can see on the end action, it's a stop by default as normal. But if we click on that now, we've actually got a new vehicle path action point. So on the rush hour path, expand out selected points, expand out vehicle path, and come down to action at point. And we're going to choose stop destroy. So we can see that changes to an X. And what's going to happen is the vehicle is going to stop at that point, and then once it's come to a complete stop, the vehicle will destroy. You might get a small pile up, the vehicles might hit each other, and they might take a little bit longer to stop, but that's not that big of a deal. They will eventually go. But the point is we're not going to have 100 vehicles just build up there. And one other thing we can do is we can change the stop hardness to stop a little bit harder there as well. So I'll change that to 2.0. And we'll simulate it, and we'll just watch the vehicles come in and stop. So yeah, now we can see that the vehicles are removing themselves when they get to the end of the path. Okay, so that's about all that I wanted to show you with the Convoy Spawner. As you can see, it's quite a simple system, but by placing many paths and a few Convoy Spawners, you should be able to get reasonable background traffic going on. And if you wanted to, what you could do is you could duplicate the path or place another path that's right there and have it turn off on another corner earlier, and then have 2 Convoy Spawners, one on each path, that spawn at separate intervals. And you could interleave your traffic in a way that, you know, some traffic goes forward and some traffic turns off. So I expect you should be able to layer these on each other in fairly interesting ways to make convincing background traffic. It's of course not a full traffic system. It's meant to be a way to be able to create fake background traffic in a way that's controllable. So don't expect them to stop at stoplights and so on. One last thing that I wanted to show off how to do is I mentioned that you don't always have to record the traffic. If you don't want to record the traffic and they're not going to be interfering with your scene in any way, and it's just background traffic, the easiest way to do that is just lay out the path like we spoke about, and then also set up the convoy system. And then right before you do your render with movie render queue, you just quickly add your sequence to the scene, and under settings, what you want to do is you want to make sure that you've got the anti-aliasing option added. And then under here, you can see that we've got these warm-up counts. The engine warm-up count is really what matters here. And so you can really do interesting things. We can actually have the world tick and run ahead before we start our render. So in this case, you want to do something like your frame rate times how many seconds you want it to warm up for. So if we were to open up Calculator, for instance, and say I'm rendering at 24 FPS, and I want to preload 50 seconds of cars to make sure the traffic is fully populated in the level, I would go 24 times 50, and that would give me 1200 frames. And then if we come down to engine warm-up count, type in 1200, and when we then render using these settings, the world is going to be all warmed up and the traffic is all going to be populated in the level before our render begins. And that's how you can get away without having to record all the traffic, and you can just let the traffic happen in the background. Now I thought we'd cover the new tap handbrake feature. There's a few extra parts to the tap handbrake feature, a few extra features that really make handbrakes that little bit better. First thing is that really to do a power slide or an interesting handbrake turn, we really need to be able to control the speed at which it corners. So the first thing I've added is a way to control the cornering aggressiveness, which I call the cornering force modifier. Let's begin by adding a path so we can see what we're talking about. Let's call this rush hour path. Drag it down. We'll just quickly drag this all the way out. So now we've got a path going. We'll come back to the start of the path. So there's two ways to modify the cornering force, and they both actually build on top of each other. To begin, when you train a vehicle, rush hour actually measures the cornering force performance of a vehicle. It tries to detect when it slides out and when it loses control and so on. It's not necessarily perfect there, but it usually does a pretty good approximation. This new feature will both enable you to have a bit more power to override that, but also specifically when we want to approach a corner at a different speed than the car is capable of, this allows us to override that. The first way to modify it is if we select the path itself and come down on the right here, we'll expand this out. And under rush hour path, let's just set up a few things. We want to go with racer. Actually, let's go with frantic, and we're going to choose a sedan. So we can see immediately here, we've got this cornering force modifier. Let's just quickly see how the vehicle performs without modifying the cornering force modifier. So if we hit start now and go selected viewport, we're just going to watch the speed in the top right. So as it approaches the corner, it slows down and it mostly stays in control, but we slow down to about 65 kilometers an hour. So let's stop that. And if we were to modify the cornering force modifier on the path, let's change that to 2. This is quite an extreme value. Usually you're going to have to experiment a little bit to find a value that works for your car, but generally maybe even 1.5 might be enough. It's sort of unitless, so you're going to have to, again, experiment. Don't forget that there's another way to modify the cornering force modifier that I'll show you in a little bit, and they build on top of each other. So if you set the path to have a really high cornering force, then it's going to affect your settings later on. So be a little bit careful with modifying this. So let's hit play. And it slowed down to 65 kilometers an hour before, so we should see what it looks like now. Doesn't really slow down at all, and he goes straight through. And he slowed down to about 90 k's an hour. So if we change that to 1.5, Still went out of control, but stayed much more close on the track and didn't go completely off the world, and got to about 80 k's an hour, I think. So that's okay. So that's the first way to modify it. So I'm going to change that back to 1.0. Generally, I probably don't want to use that too much unless I really know that I want the car in general to go much faster. In this case though, there's only one corner and I really want to control this particular corner much better. So the first thing I'll do is I'll come down to this point, and I'm going to select that individual point. On the path, make sure selected points is expanded, vehicle path is expanded. And we can see here on this individual point, we've also got cornering force modifier. The way this works is that the vehicle continually reads the cornering force modifier as it goes around the track. It also reads how much it should be cornering at any given point. So it can read this dynamically throughout the navigating the course. So what it's going to do is at this point here, it's going to have a cornering force of 1. As we get to this one, it's going to slowly increase to whatever value we choose. In this case, I've chosen 1.5. And then as it gets to this point, it's going to go back down to 1.0 right now. But we actually want this to be more like 1.5 still. So it's going to start at 1, increase to 1.5 here, stay at 1.5, and then come down to 1.0 here. And this should allow us to have a lot more control over this specific corner. And by choosing a little bit before and after the corner, we can control a little bit more how it navigates throughout the length of the corner. You can have it slow down throughout a corner by doing that, and so on. Oh, we hit the curb there. But yeah, so let's start with that. I'm fairly happy with how it's cornering there. So what we'll quickly do is we might do the tap handbrake here. So we select this point here, and we're going to come across to this action at point. We're going to go tap handbrake. And that enables a few other options for us. Here we can choose steering override. When you do a tap handbrake, for the duration of the handbrake, which starts off at 0.5 seconds, it will take complete control of the steering. So rush hour will stop steering and it will just do what you've told it to do here. So in this case, we might want it to steer to the left. So to steer to the left, you go to a negative number, and if you steer to the right, you go to a positive number. So -1 is all the way to the left and +1 is all the way to the right. So we want it to steer like maybe 50% left. So what we'll do is we'll go -0.5, and it's going to steer to the left as it does this handbrake. I've also noticed that the speed is quite low. So what we're going to do is we're going to come down to the rush hour path, and we're going to change the reset speed to 200, and we're going to reset the path speed. And if we come back up, we can see the entire path. It's going to try and aim for 200 kilometers an hour, miles an hour, sorry. So let's see how that looks. So it did do the tap handbrake. I'm not particularly happy with its performance there. The camera angle certainly didn't do it any favors. But what we'll do is we'll select that point again. We'll change that to 2.0. We're going to change that point to 2.0 also. This point to maybe 1.5. And that point is probably fine. Yep. So let's see how that goes, and we'll choose a better camera angle this time. There we go, that's better. So it mounted the curb. I don't really want it to mount the curb, so there's a few things I can do. I could play with those cornering force modifiers and bring that down. I could come over to it and make it actually tap the handbrake earlier. And I could also make it steer left much harder. So let's see how it goes now. went even worse. But yeah, these are things that you can just keep on massaging to get the value that you want. So we'll give it one more go. We'll slow the cornering force modifier down a little bit. Make it go to 1.75. And we'll see where we get to with that. That's a bit better. That's closer to what I want. So one thing I will point out is that because it's a simulation, you are going to have to run it like that. Obviously, there's a fair bit of iteration time in that. It's certainly better than doing it with a gamepad, but there's undoubtedly some iteration time. So a few tips that I wanted to give you there to make sure that you can reduce how long it takes you to do this. A common thing I see some people do is they try and lay out the whole path for the whole race in one go. And every time they want to see a change to one part of the path right near the end of the race, they have to watch the whole path all the way through. Unless your video is essentially going to try and do like a one-take video, there's no need to have to do the vehicle all in one path. The best way to do it is actually approach it a little bit more like you might film vehicles in real life. So you might even set up one path for each individual corner or each individual stretch, each camera angle. So don't be afraid to, break your path up and you race up into many segments of rush hour paths. And then that way you can focus on individual parts of the race at a time and reduce your render time, reduce your iteration time and all of that. I really would recommend breaking up your path as much as possible. You could go to the extreme and go for every single camera angle you choose. You could have a new path if you really want. But I'd recommend more so every straight or every corner, do a single path for that. And then that would really bring down your iteration time, allow you to choose individual speeds, allows you to really art direct what's going on while allowing the simulation to take over. With that, we've seen the tap handbrake and we've seen the cornering force modifier. There's one more thing that I wanted to show you that's happening behind the scenes. One trick that games use to make vehicles power slide better is that they actually shift the center of mass. So they're actually changing the simulation properties of the vehicle as the simulation is happening. So this is already configured on any vehicles that you import with the Rush Hour importer. But if you have your own vehicle and you really want to make it slide out a little bit more because maybe it's not sliding out with that handbrake, you're going to have to upset that car in some way. So I've got a fairly easy way to do that I've included with Rush Hour. This is how the Rush Hour vehicles work. So if you come down to, once again, to plugins, come down to plugins and Rush Hour vehicle animator content, blueprints, vehicle common, we can see there's this blueprint, rush hour, handbrake, center of mass shifter. So this center of mass shifter is just going to monitor a vehicle, and when it detects that the handbrake is pressed, it's going to shift the center of mass backwards or in the direction that we want. So we could make it go higher, which is going to give it more body roll. We could make it go lower, which is going to steady the vehicle up. We could shift it to the back, which is going to make the tail slide out more. Exactly how you want to tune this for an individual car really depends on your vehicle setup and so on. But it's just a really easy way that you don't have to disturb your vehicle setup that you're very happy with, but you do want it to power slide a little bit easier. You can just add this onto your vehicle and it's not going to upset your vehicle as it is. I'll just quickly show you how it's done. So if we go to the Rush Hour vehicles included, I'm going to open up the sedan that's included by default. I'm going to make sure I open the full blueprint editor. And on the left, under these components, I can see that I've already got this Rush Hour handbrake center of mass shifter added. So if you don't have that, which you wouldn't on a vehicle that you're creating yourself, you would just go up to here and go add, and you search for shifter. And you can just add the BPRH com shifter. If you don't see it, just go back to plugins, Rush Hour, vehicle animator content, vehicle common, and double click it. And that will just force Unreal to load it. And then you should see it in there. So once you've added it to your vehicle, it should automatically take over when the handbrake is enabled. It does run on tick, so it's not the cheapest thing in the world, but it's not terribly expensive either. But it's just something to be aware of. and it will just continually monitor until the handbrake is pressed. And we can see here that there's two settings that are interesting to change here. The first one is the center of mass adjustment. By default, it's changing it on the X value. So what it's doing when it's moving at 18 units negative, it's actually moving 18 centimeters backwards. That center of mass of the vehicle has shifted backwards, which on these particular vehicles makes them slide out more. On your vehicle, you're going to have to choose the value that works for you. But yeah, generally, if you move it backwards, the tail's going to slide out more. The next thing is the center of mass shift duration. This is how long it takes to shift backwards. If it were to just instantly snap backwards, you would see the car spring immediately, and it doesn't look all that great. So this is in seconds. By shifting in 150 milliseconds, it does a much more of a smooth transition. So that's going to happen over several frames, and that's going to smooth out that what would otherwise be a snap in the center of mass. So I would recommend keeping it there. We don't want to delay it too much because then it would take too long to be responsive, but we don't want it to be instant because then we can actually see the car rock too much straight away. So I find 150 milliseconds is pretty good. But yeah, that's it. You just add this handbrake shifting component to your vehicle and you choose how much you want it to adjust your center of mass. This is an offset for the existing center of mass. It will not change. This is not an absolute value. So negative 18 will move it backwards 18 centimeters from the starting point. This is not an absolute value. So that's it with handbrakes. It's fairly easy to control. There will be a little bit of experimenting to get the exact scene that you want, but because it's all simulated, you're going to get a really nice authentic movement. It's not going to look overly slidey. It should look real nice. You should be able to get some real nice results with this, and I can't wait to see what everyone does with it. Those are the main features I want to highlight in the latest Rush Hour 1.4 release. There's a lot more included as well. Make sure you go over the release notes to get a better picture of what's included. There's a new version of the example project, and there's a new input INI file, which enables gamepad control as well. So make sure you do read those release notes and take full advantage of it. I can't wait to see what everyone produces.